Hello, I'm Paul Roberts and I'm very pleased to be with you, although I'm not with you. I visited Santa Cruz a couple of years ago and I played in the magnificent chapel there, the concert hall, on a beautiful piano, and it was one of the loveliest experiences of my American tour. So I'm very grateful to John Orlando for inviting me back virtually. And I need also to thank the sponsors. So that is Lens Arts, the Arts Council of Santa Cruz, Our Family Properties, and Roland and Pat Rebelli. Donors all. And if any of you watching would like to donate tonight, it would be lovely if you would give $15 or anything that you would like to. So now over to me and to Debussy and Impressionism. And when we think of Impressionism, of course, we think of Claude Monet. But we also think of Pissarro and Renoir and the post-impressionists, Paul Gauguin. And outside my window here, we are in my studio at home, we are in the south of England, is something that resembles a Pissarro landscape. His landscapes were of northern France, so northern Europe, and I am in the southmost of England, so I'm in northern Europe, and not very far over the channel is the Normandy and the Brittany coastline, and that is where Monet did a lot of his paintings. Debussy's milieu at the beginning of the 20th century, so we're talking about the 1900s, early 1900s, was replete with visual images. Art was everywhere. Art was on posters. It was on the metro. It was in cafes. It was all around. I'm going to show you some archetypal images. You will all know what this is, the Eiffel Tower. This is looking out on to the Paris exhibition of 1900, and it was a picture, a photo, that was taken, very interestingly, by Émile Zola, the novelist. And then we have this beautiful Boulevard de Montmartre by Pissarro, that wonderful bustling landscape, bustling cityscape, with everything slightly blurred and moving. And I took this photo not very long ago, well, maybe 20 years ago, and it's still there, of the metro in Paris, the Metropolitan Underground. And you can see there an Art Nouveau lamp and Art Nouveau lettering on the Metropolitan, and an ordinary street with trees. And then my fourth image for this introduction is the illustrated front cover to a very popular magazine, L'Image. Now we all know about Debussy's image, pictures, and that word was all around him. Debussy said, "I think I love pictures almost as much as music." He also said, "You do me a great honour in calling me a pupil of Claude Monet." A critic at the end of his life had compared him to the landscapes, the seascapes, the cathedrals, the poplars, the series paintings of Monet. It was inescapable for Debussy. He didn't make deliberate reference to him. La Cathédrale Engloutie, which I'm going to play you now, the submerged cathedral, may well be inspired by Monet, but also it was definitely inspired by an old folk tale from Brittany about a cathedral that rises out of the waves once a year. The calmness of the sea is disturbed by this extraordinary apparition. It's a fairy story, it's a kind of ghost story of a cathedral rising out, and then the bells and the plain chant, and euphemistically, because I'm sure medieval cathedrals didn't have organs, Debussy throws in a wonderfully loud, clangorous organ in the middle section. Now, Cathédrale engloutie, though, begins with very large, magisterial chords. Heard from a distance, they're marked pianissimo, but one can imagine them as these great pillars of Monet's cathedral. Monet painted the cathedral in very, very many different lights, and I will show you some of the different images of this Cathedral of Rouen, glimmering, shadowing, vibrating. Debussy said, he spoke of the vibrant beauty of sound itself. And he may well have been thinking of what Gauguin said, which is, colour is vibration, just like music is. So at the beginning of Cathédrale, then we have the next pillar. Then we have one more pillar. There's a sense of a large volume, a large mass. And I do feel that it is justified for the critic to mention Debussy's relationship to Monet. And I'm sure that he had Monet's cathedrals in mind. The critic, maybe not Debussy, but everything adds up, everything is connected. The extraordinary visual world of Debussy's years in the early 1900s tells us that everything is in flux, everything is fluid, everything is connecting. So, I will play you Debussy's Engulfed Cathedral. There's so much I'd love to tell you about that piece, but we have to move on. But I will say one or two things. Very interestingly, Debussy uses visual images as his instructions. At one point, he says, this has to be played as if in a mist. And then he says, little by little coming out of the mist. This wonderful passage where we begin to hear the sea undulating. He goes from those quarter notes into triplet eighth notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have this little by little rising from the sea, coming out of the mist. And then a bell, of course. The bells are easy, aren't they? On a piano, I mean. If you're writing about a cathedral, bells are what you're going to think about. The very opening. These are bells. Of course they are. And the plain chant Debussy writes a lovely remark there. He writes that he wants the sound to be concentré, concentrated. You can imagine the monks intoning without vibrato. And I think that's what he captures very well. And then, of course, here's the organ. A kind of ecstasy of clanging bells or organ pipes. The same critic who said that Debussy was a pupil of Claude Monet had this to say about Debussy's art of piano writing. He said, and we've just witnessed it, I think, no one else had his gift of transforming a dissonant chord into a little bell made of bronze or silver, scattering its harmonics to the four winds. Later on, I'm going to be playing you a piece called The Moon Set Behind the Ancient Temple. Of course, it begins with bells. Transforming a dissonant chord. Into a little bell made of bronze or silver, scattering its harmonics to the four winds. But first, before I get to that wonderful image from Book 2, picture, I'm going to connect a little Monet to Japanese art. Monet said this. He said it somewhere. I should be regarded by posterity as a contemporary of Stéphane Mallarmé and Claude Debussy. Like them, and like Baudelaire, I say there are points at which the arts meet. We needn't detain ourselves at this moment with Mallarmé and Baudelaire, although they are crucial to Debussy's art. Mallarmé, the great symbolist poet whom Debussy knew extremely well in his young life, and Baudelaire, the father of symbolism, the previous generation. Baudelaire had a lot of very, very fascinating things to say about painting, and I hope later on I can read you some of them. The importance of Mallarmé is that he said, to name an object is to destroy 3/4 of the pleasure of a poem. To suggest, therein lies the ideal. And it's this art of suggestion that the Impressionist painters got very much from Japanese wood block prints. Monet said, compare me to the Japanese, their powers of suggestion, which evoke presence by a shadow, the complete picture by a fragment. My example is a rather interesting one, and those of you who know this piece might not have associated it with Japanese prints. I'm going to play you Debussy's prelude, Footsteps in the Snow. Debussy revered the colour prints of Hokusai and Hiroshige. And there are many Hiroshige prints of snow. And the one that I'm going to show you is of footsteps in the snow, or footprints in the snow. It's not called that, but here they are. They can be seen very clearly. Whether Debussy knew this print, we do not know. We do know that he adored Japanese prints. So it is extremely likely. But whether Footsteps in the Snow is a direct reference, I very much doubt. I mean, the mystery of artistic creation is well, it's a mystery. And Debussy certainly would have imbibed so many different influences from poetry and from painting and from music that would go into his creation of his piano music. But let us listen to Footsteps in the Snow. It has a continual rhythmic ostinato going all the way through, except for one moment towards the end, which is this. What we have there is a dissonance, a major second, and then that resolves onto a minor third. Which immediately, with the rhythm, evokes a trudging. It evokes a tension and a relaxation. It evokes coldness. Debussy writes underneath those first bars, he writes, this rhythm must evoke a sad and desolate landscape. Some rhythm to evoke a sad and desolate landscape, but it has to be the harmony too, doesn't it? And it has to be the whole piece. Whether we relate it to a Japanese print, I don't know. But somewhere behind it is that coldness and that visual precision of Japanese art. these preludes are quite extraordinary pieces. Each one of the 24 is a world of its own, incredibly concentrated, and everyone is different. Ravel revered the Debussy preludes. He was so excited, he went out and bought a copy, I think, soon after they were published, and he wrote with great excitement to a friend, "Have you seen Debussy's preludes?" And then he named several of them. Extraordinary. I think that meeting of minds at the beginning of the 20th century is so exciting. I'm now going to move on to another aspect of Debussy which connects him with the Japanese, because Japanese art at the beginning of the 20th century and at the end of the 19th, among Debussy's milieu, in the Impressionist milieu, Japanese art was associated with a much wider interest and fashion for Orientalism. People wore Japanese costume. People collected Japanese prints, Chinese painting, Chinese ceramics, blue and white pottery. And there was also, of course, in the great exhibition for which the Eiffel Tower was built in 1889, the great Paris exhibition of commerce and art in Paris, there appeared for the first time for most people the Javanese gamelan orchestra, a collection of percussion instruments, gongs and bells and metallophones. And the painters and the musicians and the poets were utterly intrigued by this wonderfully exotic and strangely, specifically non-Western sound. Painters, in response to Japanese art, changed the technique of their painting, changed what painting can do, and musicians, in response to Javanese gamelan music, changed the nature of their harmony and of their rhythm. Debussy said, when you hear a Javanese gamelan, the counterpoint of Palestrina seems like child's play. So he was complementing the extraordinary complexity and richness of the intertwining lines of gamelan music. The piece I'm going to play is the first image from Book 2, Bells Heard Through the Leaves. So we get a combination of Orientalism, we get a whole tone scale, which isn't really an Oriental scale, but to Western ears, that and the pentatonic scale is the nearest we can get on a piano to a vague sense of non-Western sounds. This combines that influence with Impressionist tone painting. So we hear bells, very obviously, but what about the leaves? The rustling of leaves. And somewhere within the combination of sounds and resonances of this piece, we can imagine the rustling of leaves. We don't have to. I don't think anything is specific. And the trouble is, when I talk about it, I'm making it more specific than it is. But nevertheless, I'm going to show you where I think the leaves are in the middle section. He writes, to be played as if in an iridescent mist. So there's also a visual image playing here on this chord. Remember what the critic said, he had the knack of turning a dissonance into a most beautiful bell-like sound, throwing its harmonics to the four winds. So, and against that we have the bell. Bells heard through the leaves. You will know by now that I am a great admirer of Debussy. And I said, after I played you a prelude, how wonderful those pieces are, and I told you about Ravel's admiration for them. And now, I think these Images, Book 2, are some of the most extraordinary music he wrote. But then, every piece of Debussy makes me think it's the best piece. So whenever I play one piece, I think, yes, this is it, until I play the next piece. And then I realize, no, this is it too. Kandinsky had, the Russian abstract painter, had a great admiration for Debussy. Kandinsky's work, theoretically actually, is fascinating in as much as that he drew very much on music and he tried to convey the techniques of music in the Mallarmé kind of way, that suggestion and not specific reference. And Kandinsky, of course, was one of the first painters to move towards abstraction. There's a wonderful story here because it goes back a long way. It goes back to Baudelaire. I'm going to read you something that Baudelaire wrote at least 40, 50 years before. I'm going to show you a great romantic painting by a great French romantic painter called Delacroix, Eugène Delacroix. Baudelaire revered Delacroix, but he said something utterly extraordinary about him. He said, looking at Delacroix, one dreams of musical harmonies and melodies. The impression we carry away from his paintings is, as it were, musical. So way back in the middle of the 19th century, we are getting this move towards a combination, a unity of visual imagery and music. And we're not only, well, we are getting it theoretically as well. We're getting critics like Baudelaire, we're getting this idea that something new is happening in Western art. He also said, and this is fascinating, if you think how we look at an Impressionist painting, we stand back from it, don't we, until it all coheres. You look close at it and all you see is a series of dashes and dots. And you come back and suddenly the whole image coalesces. Well, now listen to what Baudelaire said, long before Impressionism. The right way of knowing whether a picture is melodious is to look at it from far enough away to make it impossible for us to see what it's about or to appreciate its lines. If it is melodious, it already has a meaning. So, for Baudelaire, stepping back from a Delacroix painting turned it into an abstract combination of colours. Impossible for us to see what it is about. Whereas for us, looking at Impressionist paintings, we stand back and it all coalesces. We all see suddenly how this image vibrates. But they are actually talking about the same thing. They're talking about colour is vibration, just as music is, which is what Gauguin said and was how I began my lecture. So to return to Kandinsky and his relevance for the image that I've just played and for the image I'm about to play, the second image from Book 2, the moon set behind the ancient temple. He writes, modern composers such as Debussy present spiritual impressions which they often derive from nature and which they refine into spiritual visions by musical means. So we have the Impressionist side of Debussy derived from nature. bells through the leaves, water, the cathedrals, visual images that mean something, specifically, representational art. And we also have that ineffable quality of music, which doesn't refer to anything but itself. It touches you, it touches your deepest instincts, it touches your emotions, and you're not quite sure how. And in the piece that I'm about to play, the second of the Images, I believe what Kandinsky was saying refers very much to what Debussy does in this piece. This is a collection of bells evoking an ancient temple in the moonlight. So there's a sense of a long past, a visionary past, the ancient world, and there's also a sense of non-Western, Eastern, therefore, music, procedures. Pierre Boulez said of this piece that it obeys Eastern sense of time, not a Western sense of time. bells heard, no, not bells heard through the leaves, this is the moon set behind the temple. Et la lune descend sur le temple qui fut. Behind the temple that was. But it doesn't sound terribly good in English, but it sounds wonderful in French. So now we're going to return to Monet, and I'm going to play you Reflets dans l'eau, Reflections in the Water. And this certainly could be related to Monet's pictures of poplars reflected in the river. So we have lines of poplars going across the canvas, and then they go into the water and they slightly shimmer. These are series paintings too. He painted many different versions of the poplar trees at different times of day. There was a beautiful exhibition of David Hockney in London very recently, and during lockdown this great painter taught himself to paint on an iPad. He used the tools of an iPad and he used his finger, and he painted the most beautiful landscapes. And they owe so much to the Impressionists, unashamedly referencing the famous Impressionist paintings. And the one that I will show you is definitely inspired by Monet's poplars. And he manages to capture the shimmer of water on the surface of a lily pond, Hockney, with his finger on an iPad. Quite extraordinary and beautiful art. Debussy's Reflets dans l'eau. Debussy's Reflet dans l'eau with a slightly different note from what Debussy would have written, but I'm sure he wouldn't have minded towards the end. I have 5 minutes left, so I am now going to revert to a completely different piece, nothing to do with Monet, and probably nothing to do with Impressionism, although if you recall the wonderful paintings of bars, Éloi de Manet, the bar of the Folies Bergère, the interiors, the music halls, the pleasure gardens of Impressionist painting, maybe this does relate. I'm going to play you Debussy's Interrupted Serenade, La Sérénade Interrompue. And I believe it fits very much into something that he said, which was utterly extraordinary and curious, writing about his orchestral image, a great triptych of symphonic music. And one of the great pieces, one of the great movements in that is called Iberia, Spain. And at the rehearsal, Debussy was terribly excited because he said he heard things that he had intended, but he wasn't sure they would have worked. And he said, I can hear the boy whistling, and there's a young man in the street and the town square, and he visualized it all and he could hear it in the music. And he wrote this to a friend about what he was trying to do in the orchestral image. And he said, I'm trying to do, in inverted commas, something else. In a way, in inverted commas, realities. What imbeciles call Impressionism. A term as misused as it could possibly be. And I think this little prelude, just a few minutes, is an example of Debussyan realities. This is a comic tale. It tells of, Debussy didn't tell us this, but it's definitely in the music. It tells of an instrumentalist probably playing a mandolin or a guitar, tuning it up. At the beginning, Debussy writes to be played as if improvised. Then he starts his song, and it's a love song. He's serenading his sweetheart, maybe at an upper window, and he's down in the street. And he's interrupted. What is he interrupted by? No one knows. But you will hear the interruption. The second time he's interrupted, it's very clever, because he's interrupted by the composer Debussy. This passage is Debussy quoting his own orchestral image. He's quoting a passage from his Spanish movement. Guitarists playing in the night, maybe in the evening. And our serenader is interrupted by this piece of music. So this is a piece of guitar music, a piece of vocal music, and a miniature theatre. This is music theatre, writ large, in 3 minutes. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you live. Thank you.